August 6th, 1915. You're Private Tommy Atkins of the Manchester Regiment, and you're about to charge up a hill that doesn't even have a proper name. The Turks call it Chunuk Bayir. Your officers just call it the objective. But in 3 hours, it's going to become your grave. You've been at Gallipoli for 3 months now, and you've watched thousands of good men die for a few yards of rocky ground. But this time feels different. This time, the generals promise, you're going to break through, take the high ground, win the war. As you fix your bayonet and wait for the whistle, you look around at your mates. Billy from Liverpool, who joined up the same day you did. Old Sam, who lied about his age to get into the army. Young Davies, who still writes to his mum every week. You don't know it yet, but most of them won't see another sunrise. What you also don't know is that a century later, their bones will still be up there on that hill, forgotten by history, unmarked by any memorial. Because some battles are too painful to remember, and some soldiers are too inconvenient to honor. Today, I'm going to tell you about the hill that holds the remains of Gallipoli's forgotten soldiers, why their sacrifice was erased from history, and how the truth about what happened on Chunuk Bayir is finally coming to light. The August offensive at Gallipoli was supposed to be the breakthrough that ended the nightmare. For 3 months, Allied forces had been stuck on narrow beaches, dying by the thousands for a few yards of Turkish soil. The original landings in April had failed. The summer had brought nothing but casualties and disease. General Sir Ian Hamilton had a new plan. While diversionary attacks pinned down Turkish forces at the existing beachheads, a fresh corps would land at Suvla Bay and advance inland. Meanwhile, the Anzac forces would break out of their cove and capture the high ground, including a ridge called Chunuk Bayir. The key to the plan was Chunuk Bayir, a hill that rose 850 feet above the Dardanelles. From its summit, you could see the entire peninsula. More importantly, you could direct artillery fire onto the Turkish positions below. Whoever held Chunuk Bayir controlled the battlefield. The attack began before dawn on August 6th. In the darkness, columns of British, Australian, and New Zealand troops began climbing the steep ravines that led to the Turkish positions. They moved in silence, hoping to achieve surprise. The New Zealand and Australian light horse reached the lower slopes of Chunuk Bayir just as the sun was rising. They'd achieved complete surprise. The Turkish trenches were lightly held, and the defenders were caught off guard. For a brief moment, it looked like the breakthrough had finally come. But then, everything started going wrong. The ships couldn't see their targets in the darkness. The artillery barrage fell short, hitting the advancing Allied troops instead of the enemy. Communication broke down. Field telephones were cut, and runners were shot down. Worst of all, the different units couldn't find each other in the maze of ravines and ridges. The New Zealanders reached one part of Chunuk Bayir, but they were isolated. The British forces were lost in the broken ground, while Turkish reinforcements rushed to the scene. Lieutenant Colonel William Malone of the Wellington Battalion was one of the few officers who knew exactly where he was. A former schoolteacher from New Zealand, Malone had studied every map of the peninsula. When his men reached the summit of Chunuk Bayir at dawn on August 7th, he knew they'd achieved something remarkable. "We hold the key to the whole position," Malone wrote in his last letter home. "If we can just hold on until reinforcements arrive, we can win this thing." But the reinforcements never came. Instead, Mustafa Kemal arrived with 2 fresh divisions. Kemal understood immediately what was at stake. If the Allies held Chunuk Bayir, the entire Turkish position would collapse. What happened next was one of the most vicious battles of the entire Gallipoli campaign. For 3 days, a few hundred New Zealanders and British troops held the summit against repeated Turkish attacks. They had no proper trenches, no overhead cover, almost no ammunition. Malone was killed on the 2nd day, shot through the head by a Turkish sniper. His men buried him in a shallow grave on the hilltop and kept fighting. One by one, the officers fell. The sergeants took command, then the corporals, then just whoever was left alive. Private Billy Atkins from Manchester wrote in his diary, "We're down to our last few rounds. The Turks keep coming, wave after wave. I don't think we're getting off this hill alive." He was right. On August 10th, Kemal launched his final assault. 2 Turkish divisions attacked the handful of Allied survivors on Chunuk Bair. The fighting was hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, in trenches so shallow they were more like scratches in the rocky ground. The Allied line broke. The survivors, maybe 50 men out of the hundreds who had reached the summit, were overwhelmed and killed. The Turks retook Chunuk Bair, and with it, any chance of Allied victory at Gallipoli. In the chaos of the retreat, nobody kept proper records of who had died on Chunuk Bair. The bodies were left where they fell, scattered across the hilltop. When the Allies evacuated Gallipoli in December, those men were simply listed as missing in action. Their families back home never knew what had happened to them. Some held out hope for years, thinking their sons might be prisoners of war. The truth was simpler and more heartbreaking. They were dead on a hill in Turkey, and nobody was coming back for them. After the war, the Imperial War Graves Commission built beautiful cemeteries at the landing beaches. But Chunuk Bair was different. It was in Turkish territory, and the battle had been such a disaster that the British military didn't want to draw attention to it. The official histories barely mentioned the fighting on the hill. The few survivors were told not to talk about what they'd seen. It was easier to forget about Chunuk Bair than to explain why so many men had died for nothing. So the dead were forgotten. Rain and wind scattered their bones. Wild grass grew over their shallow graves. Within a few years, there was almost no trace that a battle had ever been fought there. But the local Turkish villagers remembered. They would find buttons and badges, pieces of equipment, sometimes even bones when working their fields. They knew foreign soldiers were buried on their land, but they didn't know who they were. Then, in the 1990s, Dr. Harvey Broadbent, an Australian historian, began studying the August Offensive using Turkish sources that had been ignored. He discovered that the battle for Chunuk Bair had been far more significant than anyone had realized. "The more I learned, the more angry I became," Broadbent said. These men had achieved something remarkable. They'd actually reached their objective and held it against impossible odds. But their story had been buried along with their bodies. In 2000, Broadbent organized the first expedition to search for remains. Working with Turkish archaeologists, and what they found was heartbreaking. Scattered across the hill were the remains of dozens of soldiers, British, Australian, and New Zealand troops who had died in the August Offensive. Their bones were mixed with pieces of equipment, uniform buttons, and personal items that had somehow survived nearly a century in the Turkish soil. One of the most poignant discoveries was a small leather wallet containing a photograph of a young woman and a letter that began, "My dearest Tom." The paper was too fragile to read completely, but you could make out phrases like, "Thinking of you always," and "Come home safe." Tom never made it home. His bones were found 50 yards from where the wallet was discovered, along with the remains of his rifle and the brass buttons from his Manchester Regiment uniform. The Turkish government, to their credit, has been supportive of efforts to identify and honor these forgotten soldiers. They've allowed archaeologists to work on Chunuk Bair and have helped facilitate the return of remains to their home countries when possible. But the process is slow and difficult. After a century in the ground, it's often impossible to identify individual soldiers. DNA testing can sometimes help, but only if there are living relatives to provide comparison samples. Most of the families of these men are long gone. Still, the work continues. Every summer, teams of archaeologists and volunteers return to Chunuk Bair to search for more remains. They've found evidence of the desperate fighting that took place there: shell fragments, bullet casings, and the shallow scrapes that served as trenches during the 3-day battle. They've also found evidence of the humanity of the soldiers who fought there. a small metal cross, probably torn from someone's neck during the fighting. A brass button from a New Zealand uniform, polished smooth by a soldier's nervous fingers. A pencil stub, worn down to almost nothing, that someone had used to write what might have been their last letter home. The hill today is peaceful. Turkish farmers graze their sheep on the slopes where men once died by the hundreds. Wildflowers bloom in the spring, and the view across the Dardanelles is beautiful. It's hard to imagine that this quiet place was once the scene of such desperate fighting. But if you know where to look, you can still see traces of the battle. The ground is uneven in places where trenches were dug and filled in. Metal detectors still occasionally find bullets and shell fragments. And sometimes, after heavy rains, bones work their way to the surface. The Turkish villagers treat these discoveries with respect. They understand that these are the remains of young men who died far from home, fighting for causes they probably didn't fully understand. When bones are found, they're carefully collected and turned over to the authorities. There's a small memorial on Chunuk Bair now, erected by the New Zealand government to honor the men who died there. It's a simple stone monument with the names of the units that fought on the hill. But most of the individual soldiers remain nameless, their identities lost to time and the chaos of battle. The inscription on the memorial reads, "To the memory of the officers and men who fell in the attack on Chunuk Bair, August 1915. Their names liveth forevermore." It's a noble sentiment, but not entirely accurate. Many of their names have been forgotten, and their stories have been lost. But perhaps that's changing. The work of historians like Harvey Broadbent and the ongoing archaeological efforts on Chunuk Bair are slowly bringing these forgotten soldiers back into the light. Their sacrifice is being remembered, their courage is being honored, and their stories are finally being told. The hill that holds the remains of Gallipoli's forgotten soldiers is giving up its secrets, one bone at a time. It's a slow process, and it will never be complete. Too much time has passed. Too many records have been lost. Too many families have died out. But every identification, every name recovered from the earth, every story pieced together from fragments and memories, is a small victory against the forgetting that war brings. These men died, believing their sacrifice mattered. A century later, we're finally proving them right. The forgotten soldiers of Chunuk Bair remind us that every war leaves behind more than just the heroes whose names we remember. It leaves behind the ordinary men who did extraordinary things, who held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, who died far from home for reasons they might not have fully understood. Their bones are still up there on that hill, mixed with the Turkish soil they fought so hard to hold. They're part of the landscape now, part of the history of that place. And slowly, carefully, respectfully, we're bringing them home. If you found this story of forgotten heroes as moving as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out the videos on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.